Hello, I'm Jeff Sleeman. I became interested in herbal medicine from a very early age. I was born in Christchurch, New Zealand. My parents had a 2.5 acre block of land on which the house was, and my father was a gardener and so was my maternal grandmother. Loved gardening, and that was the interest in plants. We moved when I was 15 over to Sydney in Australia, and I took up surfing and loved surfing down at the northern beaches, Manly and so on and so forth. And to keep fit in the surf, I became interested in health and ideas on health. And the only store that was a health food store was a Sanitarium health food store at the time. And I bought every book on health that I could. A lot of them were American, from Paul Bragg, people like that. And over time, I became more and more focused on actually how many of my friends were actually really falling apart. And they're only in their 20s, early 20s, but they weren't being able to actually stay out in the surf for long periods of time. The concept of restoring your health through traditional medicine is a gigantic subject. I mean, it involves me actually identifying that in my lifetime, human health has gone from bad to worse. And as a result of it, modern medicine, which more and more drugs are being dished out to people, I don't have the latest stats on that, but really what's going on is it's almost crippling budgets, government budgets globally. And the amount of money that is being spent on drugs and on medicine is not being reciprocated with human health improving. If anything, the human health is getting far worse. So what I'm saying is basically, I would say things like, autoimmune diseases were virtually unknown when I was born, 69 years ago, 1949. Cancer was probably affected 1 in 60 people. Most of them died because they didn't have the chemo or the radiotherapy today that they have today. But really what we're looking at is every year, every decade, human health gets worse in the West. It's not getting better. And I learned traditional medicine over 40 years ago, and I've continued to learn different traditions, from ancient Greek medicine through to traditional Chinese medicine, herbalism, not acupuncture, learning Ayurveda, learning Persian and Arabic medicine, and indigenous medicines from around the world. And quite honestly, they all speak from the same hymn book. They all speak the same language. They're different words they use. But what we're getting from Western medicine is something that is totally alien to traditional ideas of health. Health actually is not about well-being. Well-being is actually feeling good. And people who feel good, actually, from our point of view, are actually supposed to be healthy. Well, you can go and take a drug and feel good. You can have diabetes type 1 or 2, and you can go and actually have injections or drugs, and you feel good. And they'll say, oh, you're healthy. No, you're not. You basically got a chronic condition that really actually the body is not healing, and it's not being encouraged here because doctors do not learn about how to heal. And that's one of the things, if I described the lack in modern medicine, and I'll put it in traditional Chinese medical terminology. They talk about yin and yang, and yin is the archetypal nourishment, it's the wood, yang is the flame. And the bottom line is actually Western medicine and medicines, the drugs they use, are brilliant at pushing yang up or down. They can use anti-inflammatories to push the yang down. You can use tranquilizers to push it down. They can use antidepressants to push the yang up. But traditional medicine also deals with the yin, the nourishment. And the nourishment is not recognized at all by Western medicine. Every culture on the planet understands the whole concept of yin in Chinese medicine, the kapha approach. And often it's actually much lower doses of herbs than you would normally get when you see people prescribing herbs. The higher dose, we can do the same thing. We can push sweating. We can push diuresis. We can push laxative effects. We can push it with high doses of herbs. But if we want to restore the bowels, or we want to restore the kidneys or the bladder, if we want to restore the psyche, which the West call the nervous system, which is not, we actually use drop doses of lots of herbs. And this is actually part of everybody's traditional knowledge on medicine. So that's what I would say. And it's got nothing, health actually often feels very painful. Health has got nothing to do with feeling good. Health really comes from the ancient Indo-Aryan word health. And in English, we have the derivation of that comes into our language as the word holy, hallowed ground, heal, and the word whole, holistic, whole. And so really what we do is we have an approach, traditional medicine has an approach of health is about being connected. It's not about feeling good at all. It's about being connected. And when people are actually being connected, it's often very, very painful. My expertise in health and also in herbal medicine began when I went to Sydney University in the 1960s, and I completed 3 straight majors, English, psychology and philosophy. And then in the early 1970s, I completed a Master of Arts in Psychology, specialising in clinical and social psychology. Then over in Britain, I trained with the National Institute of Medical Herbalists for 7 years to become a member of that in about 1983-84. And coming back to Australia in the mid-1980s, for the following 30 years, I was teaching herbal medicine at 10 colleges in Sydney, Adelaide and Perth. I wrote a full-time 4-year course for a college in Adelaide and taught that for 16 years at that college. So I have had extensive experience in the writing of courses, in understanding many, many cultural approaches to herbal medicine, and also many approaches to how those cultures assessed and treated illness. And over the years, I've also had practices in England, in Bath and Chippenham. In Sydney, I had a practice in Dee Why and Balmain. And in Adelaide, up in the Adelaide Hills, and also down in the city. And I have treated many thousands of people with all vast types of illnesses. So I have an extensive experience, not only actually in the practice of herbal medicine, but also in designing courses, writing about herbal medicine. I have written a lot of articles for various herbal journals and naturopathic journals. I've given many, many public talks on health and healing, and quite novel aspects too, quite challenging lectures I have presented. And so I have had many, many years of experience, over 40 years of experience in the realm of health and herbal medicine. Health itself often is painful, and it is about reconnecting, connecting with your body, connecting with your environment, connecting with your foods, connecting with the air, connecting with everything, connecting with life. And I've quite honestly, in the 21st century, here we're in 2018, and here in Australia, the people are totally disconnected. Most people are disconnected. They're actually basically locked up. Their homes are basically Wi-Fi zones. They're connecting through electronics, but they're not actually connecting with one another. And that is a major problem in terms of health. They're not connecting with their gardens, they're not connecting with their trees, they're not connecting with winter and summer. They have air conditioning, they don't know what the temperature really is. They're not connecting with their bodies because they jump in a car and go off to work or go up to the supermarket. They don't connect with the plants they eat from the supermarket because they're packaged. That's not connection. The water that we're drinking actually coming here in South Australia comes from the Murray River, 250 sewer outlets going into it. Nobody has a clue about that because the government keeps that very quiet. But we don't have reverse osmosis processes to actually filter those chemicals out of the water. So, people are disconnected. They don't know what they're drinking in the tap water. They turn on the tap and they're drinking basically poisons in minuscule amounts, but poisons nevertheless. And the air, most people actually have been taught to deep breathe. And what you find in traditional medicine worldwide is it's all about stilling the breath. It was known actually the Lakota Indians in America, the sometimes called the Sioux Indians, that a bloke called George Catlin actually, who was an artist, went through there. And the Lakotas were telling their children, keep your mouth closed. Breathe through your noses. We don't learn that. We're actually being taught, even from Western adapted yoga, deep breathe. People actually being taught, actually, if you get stressed, do some deep breathing. And it's a cultural thing. It's a Western cultural thing. But it's wrong. Nobody has checked up. And so I'm trying to actually give information back, particularly to students of traditional medicine who would like to understand what traditional medicine, maybe practitioners who are already practicing and have not really got a good education in traditional medicine. Also for the lay public, because quite honestly, human beings actually have always actually done self-treatment. I mean, the whole concept of self-treatment is if you get what Chinese would call a wind-cold attack. A wind-cold attack is the very first part of if you get a respiratory infection and you get chilled, you get goosebumps, you'd feel cold, you wouldn't like the cold wind, you wrap up, you can't get warm. And I said that's a typical thing. This is really what's going on, is the thermostat in the brain has been set higher than 37. We used to know it as Fahrenheit, 98.6. But the thermostat has been set higher. The reason being is for every 0.55 degrees above 37 Celsius, the metabolic rate speeds up by 7%. So when you get to, say, 40 degrees Celsius, your metabolic rate is roughly 40% higher. Your breathing rate will be much elevated, so will your pulse rate. That's normal. And there were, in every tradition in the world, they understood that wind chill, wind cold attack. There were herbs to actually basically help warm a person up, like the dry ginger. Like in China, they use ma huang, the Phaedra sinica, the botanic name. These are herbs that warm a person up. And you can start to use herbs that actually do have an antimicrobial effect. In modern times we know these. Things like yarrow, peppermint tends to stop things irritating the skin, so we may use that. And say elderflowers, which is a diaphoretic, makes people sweat. What you're doing is assisting the body coming up with a temperature. When it gets to the stage where it's got to, say, 40 degrees Celsius, the person's hot, the old 104 degrees Fahrenheit, people are throwing off the blankets, they're too hot, they're red in the face instead of the pallor that when you're actually going up in temperature, the pallor has actually disappeared, they're going red. And we have herbs, and actually what we do is we swap over the dry ginger and we put the fresh ginger in the liquid, in the drink. And so they'd have fresh ginger and they'd have the elderflowers and the peppermint and the yarrow. And this is exactly what we have always done. Now, people can do this. This is actually herbs for home use. So part of my idea is basically to help ordinary people who don't understand medicine to understand the simple things that occur for all of us. Illness, as the Chinese say, is the journey to perfection. It is part of our cleansing. And every acute illness, and so really what I'm doing, every acute illness is basically an important thing. The Amazonian native people actually say that disease is a mother. It's our mother. And it's there to teach us something. The problem is people aren't learning anything. They go along to the doctor and they have a drug that actually turns off the yang, and so it suppresses. And we don't know what really is going on, and we don't learn anything. And so my point of view is there are changes to be made in breathing, in drinking, in even ideas, how people approach things, certainly in eating, and not just in the limited number of foods that we eat, but the huge number of plants that we actually have in the world. We know that the ancient Greeks used over 250 plants in a year from the work of the American primatologist Jane Goodall, that the bonobo chimpanzee, which is closest to us genetically, eats around about 186 species of plants, animals and insects in a year. Anybody who actually goes into their pantry or the equivalent and has a look and see the species of foods they eat, they're probably pushing it to get 40. The vast majority, probably about 15 to 20 plants, all bred for commercial reasons. They're not wild plants. And that's one of the reasons why health is going right off the agenda. So my idea with the series is to introduce the concept of what is health, what is disease, not from the modern point of view, but from the traditional point of view. Disease, I said, is the journey to perfection in Chinese medicine. From the Western point of view, disease is the body going wrong. Well, and obviously if they think it's going wrong and you get a temperature, they use an antipyretic to drop your temperature. I can understand the philosophy. The philosophy is actually to counter what the body is doing. Not from traditional medicine, we're quite different. So we're going to actually look at what is health and what is disease, what it means. We're going to look at human needs as we go along through this, what human beings do need as far as actually things, not what we want, but what we need physiologically, psychologically, spiritually, to actually remain healthy, to remain connected to the world. Then I'm going to have a look at the importance of acute illnesses, what they are. It's not just the respiratory tract, but it's also the bowels, it can be the bladder, it can be any part of the body, it can be the skin. And all of these things are basically signals from the body. They're all cleansing. Every single acute illness is a cleanse. And how do you deal with this? Rather than running off to a doctor to actually get an antibiotic or an anti-inflammatory. And then when we get into later on actually the chronic illnesses are a little bit more complex and require a lot more explanation for things. But really, you know, since I was born, as I said, 69 years ago, the incidence of cancer went from 1 in around about 60 people with cancer. Today, roughly actually over half of all men in Australia and close to half of all women in Australia today get cancer. As far as autoimmune disease in the 1950s was there were a few things like multiple sclerosis identified in the 1850s, Parkinson's identified actually in the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution in 1819. But most of the illnesses that we've got today were minuscule. And today what we've got is roughly they say that it's actually somewhere between 1 in 7 and 1 in 15 people has an autoimmune disease. But the evidence is probably closer to 1 in 5. 1 in 5 people with an inflammatory disease. Yes, they're soldiering on, a bit like the Codral ad. They soldier on with the anti-inflammatories and the drugs that actually the doctors are prescribing to them. But they're basically getting constant inflammation. And I will explain in the whole process, inflammation is the body going right. It's not the body going wrong. My reference point for all of this, and I will explain later on, is the human continuum, where we have come from. We've only been actually in our current sort of civilization, as we are today, for a couple of hundred years since the Industrial Revolution. For a good 10,000 years, roughly, since the end of the last ice age, we were people who were agrarian people. We were pastoralists or farmers, had animals, and we lived in small towns and villages. And over time, obviously, our technologies have improved, but we've still lived close to the land. It was the Industrial Revolution that brought people into the cities. But quite honestly, the human continuum is not actually in villages and towns. It's not civilization. Human continuum is hunters and gatherers. There's the reference point, and that's really what I'm going to tackle, is how obviously we live in urban, suburban areas. We're modern people, but we're still Stone Age people dressed up in modern garb. And so what I'm going to actually attempt to do is to describe what a traditional hunter-gatherer type of lifestyle, including diet, would entail, things that we do need. It's not going to be rushing off to the gymnasium, because you wouldn't have seen actually hunters and gatherers actually trying to do lift-ups or press-ups. But they certainly would have been physically active, and they would also, in the wintertime, been damn quiet. And when it got dark, they would also have been quiet. It's a lot of common sense with this. So that's really what my approach is going to be. In the West, we have been heavily influenced by America, no doubt about it. After the end of World War II, really the collapse of the British Empire, America actually, and the American influence has had a huge impact on the West. And that includes the American approach to many of the issues that are confronted by the American people over the centuries. And one of the things was actually in the preamble to the United Nations, it was the American Surgeon General at the time, made a statement that health is not just the absence of disease or infirmity. It is very much about well-being. And it makes total sense, because after World War II, with the Nazi scourge and the Imperial Japanese scourge being removed from the world, it was a time of optimism. I mean, I was actually one of the baby boomers coming out of that. And so, you know, it was very much about an optimistic time, looking at health from a different point of view. And it was very much this concept of we can actually basically make all people feel good, feel well. Now, as a result of it, what we do see in medicine, and you can just use your ears to listen to this, because what has happened is we hear every day that, and it's Hollywood has done it in many ways, but it's not just Hollywood, it's actually the West. We hear people have a war on things. We have a war on want, poverty. We have a war on drugs. We have a war on crime. We have a war on many, many things. And part of the thing was actually this concept of war, and it's a metaphor, it is a metaphor, that actually is coming out of the West, and everybody uses it. We have a war on disease. We have a war on cancer. We have a war on AIDS. We actually, the most ridiculous of the lot is we have a war on war. We have a war on terrorism. Now we're using these words, and that metaphor of war is very much mainstream Western medicine. And when I said, you know, before about treatment of cancer, what we're doing is it's a war on cancer. We're blitzing it, we're burning it, we're poisoning, or we're cutting it out. I mean, that's war material. The idea of actually using antis, anti-inflammatories, antimicrobials, anti-diabetics, bronchoconstriction, which is called bronchodilators. All of this opposite, using opposites, and it's called, basically, it was identified 2,500 years ago in the school, or maybe the person called Hippocrates. It's using the opposites, the contraries, the medicine as using contraries, the opposites. It does have a place in medicine. There's no doubt about that. If you've got a tremendous amount of heat in your body, you can use cold. You can use cold. If you do have tremendous amount of pain, you know, we herbalists actually, we use many of the basis for pain killing in the West is the opium poppy. Well known. Actually, you know, the tincture of laudanum, as we actually used to know it. And a lot of the English poets, even Samuel Coleridge, when he wrote Xanadu, it's actually, he was tripping high as a kite actually because of his arthritis on laudanum, a tincture of opium. So we know these things. We do actually use things to counter. We do that. But it's only one way. And the problem is that using the war metaphor on how to treat illness is not really conducive to healing. Healing is about being whole, as I said before, is about being whole, being intact. It's about connecting. It's even about connecting with your pain. Pain, obviously, if you, for example, if you get an acute illness and you get, say, you trip over and you wreck your leg, we don't know whether it's actually torn ligaments, tendons, or a broken bone, what you're going to get is redness, swelling, and pain. The redness is not the body going wrong. And so in first aid, and I used to be a first aid officer for St John Ambulance, the rote sort of treatment of inflammation, redness, is using ice. Now, that certainly was never part of traditional medicine. One, they didn't have refrigerators, they didn't have access to ice. But no, what they used to do is actually, if you get redness, if you have an acute injury, what you use is you get some sort of fabric, linen, you know, today we could actually use a flannel, and you dunk it in warm water, and then you wrap it around the leg, and you put towels and more blankets or goat skin or whatever you can, wherever it's injured. And what happens is the heat of the inflammation warms up the moisture in the flannel, in the fabric. And the result is it brings all the toxins to the surface and it makes it red. And it brings it out. And the swelling, what is the swelling? The redness is actually basically inflammation. It's the blood vessels, blood going to the area to remove the damaged tissue. The swelling is the proteins and all the rubbish being recycled by the human body. The human body is brilliant for recycling stuff. And it recycles and it goes into the lymph where the proteins are taken out and recycled for making more protein of the human body. And the pain is a good signal saying, don't exercise, don't run around. Do exactly, and if you've got domestic animals yourself, if your dog or your cat is feeling unwell, what do? If they've been injured on the road, what they do is they actually go into a dark place, under a bed, under a table. They don't move, they drink very little, they don't drink gallons of water, because that's another Western naturopathic idea. You have to have 8 litres of water, so many litres of water a day. No. You actually drink according to your thirst. Excess water damages the kidneys. If you listen to the Ayurvedic physicians, going back sort of 7,000 years, if you listen to the traditional Chinese medicine practitioners, going back 4,000 or 5,000 years, that's exactly what they all said. Excess water damages the kidneys, damages the fluids. So you're not doing that in traditional medicine. What you're doing is basically resting. And so the inflammation, the swelling and the pain is the body going right. And so health itself, from the definition of the modern world, in many ways, actually, as I said, is a feeling of feeling good, well-being, rah. And if you happen to have any interference in your life with an illness, whether it's acute or whether it's chronic, our Western medical approach is to ridding the body of that something that's gone wrong, because they believe it's gone wrong, as fast as possible. So you put the ice on the wound, you actually have the paracetamol or the aspirin to dampen down the pain. If it's really bad, you actually take, opioids, just so that you can soldier on. And the idea actually in traditional medicine is the pain, the swelling and the redness are not your body going wrong. They're the body going right. That is part of health. Believe it or not, strangely, disease is part of health. It's an essential part of health. And many people will know of people who've never, ever had an illness in their life. And they get an illness and drop dead. Now, what's going on? They never had a chance. Their body never gave them a chance to basically cleanse, because all illness is basically a cleanse. It's an almighty rest, because we're not supposed to be soldiering on. And so when we're resting, our body is cleansing in the initial stages, the first stages of any acute or chronic illness. Our bodies cleanse. So you don't feed that. You may actually remember there's an old story of starve a fever, feed a cold. That's exactly right. You starve a fever. And if you do feed a cold, you will feed the cold and you'll keep it going. In other words, the bottom line is, if you've got an illness, if you've actually been hurt, got an injury, reduce your intake of food. You're not needing to feed it up. You don't need, I myself have gone on fast, drinking nothing but water for maybe 25 days. Now, if you haven't done it before, don't do it. But bottom line is actually human beings can go for a long period of time without eating. You're not running around, you're not soldiering on, but you're drinking small amounts of water according to your thirst. And so when you actually are feeling as though you don't want to eat, that's one part of the issues I will deal with in the human needs, is your body saying, don't eat, take time off, give it a rest. The traditional perspective on health is that, number one, health is not a state. It's not a state. It's not a noun. It's not a health is not a noun. And strangely enough, actually, when I describe this, it's in many ways it's a process. So let's describe it as a process. It's a continuous thing that occurs from the moment we're born to the moment we die. In fact, from the moment of conception. Health is manifest. It's one of those words that we don't have in European language. And it's an adverbial noun. We don't have those. But it's the closest we can say it is actually it's a process. And being a process means it's going on all the time. It's not that you have it or you don't have it. Health is, even in the midst of disease, you do have health. Not the way that we describe it in the West, where we turn around and say, oh, that person's not very healthy, they've got a cough. But from the traditional point of view, health is a manifestation of what all cultures call the vital force. Chinese medicine, they actually gave attributes of that vital force. Qi, Jing, Shen, words like that you see in the Shen and the sparkle in the eye. In Ayurveda, they actually would see that very much in the prana. In the ancient Greek, they would see that in pneuma, the breath. The vital force really is actually manifest by three processes. Number one is, and not necessarily it's the first most important, but number one is the vital force is about the intelligence of life. Everywhere that you look, there is tremendous intelligence of life. If you find that life is going through a disease process, that's still intelligent. It's still tremendously intelligent. I've given a hint with the issue of cancer or autoimmune disease. But basically, the intelligence of the body is the ability of the human body to not only survive, but to grow and to reach the potential of that individual, whether it's a dog, and in Buddhism they used to talk about the Buddha nature of a dog or the Buddha nature of a cat. The Buddha nature of a human being is very much in the spiritual realm of our ability to reach our potential, our psychological potential. We are creatures actually of society, our societal potential, and obviously our spiritual potential. And certainly actually that the body that we actually have inherited with this avatar that we actually all walk around from the moment we're actually basically conceived until we actually die is basically, it's the intelligence of that. And you can see it in everything that goes on. It's not only intelligence, it's also the energy. So you will look at the vital force, the second attribute would be the energy of life. You can see the cycles of energy. We see the cycles in the seasons. We can see the intelligence of the trees that get to autumn time and they drop their leaves. And that, you know, the deciduous trees are dormant through the winter. They're resting. All the energy as far as us herbalists is concerned, if we're wanting the root vegetable, the root plants, say like marshmallow root or comfrey root, we would be collecting it in autumn time when the energy from the leaves, from the upright part of the plant is going into the ground. It's being stored over winter. You would not collect comfrey or marshmallow root in springtime because the energy, the carbohydrates in many ways, are actually going into producing the plant to come up in leaves. And so That's the intelligence of a plant. And it's manifested, and plants change from day to day. According to light patterns, they've got cycles, we've got cycles. We've not only got the circadian rhythm of the 24-hour cycle, which means actually we sleep for a good 8 hours of that period of time. And that is another issue that I'll get into later on. But sleep is a major problem in the Western world. The reason being, quite simply, is electromagnetic frequencies that are interfering with the pineal gland. So these are the energies of the body. And you can see, as I mentioned with, say, yin and yang, the daytime is when we wake up in the morning is the yang time. It's to give a description of energy. Chinese do it really well. It's like a fireplace. The yin is like the wood on a fireplace, and the yang is like the flame. If we only had wood, we'd be a corpse. If we only had yang, we'd be a spirit, but we happen to actually have this avatar, the body. So in the daytime, the yang is firing up. Whether you're going off actually doing mental work, whether you're doing physical work, the yang rises. It's the sunshine time. It's the yang time of the day. And we're active. And yes, when we're in our teens, we may well have burnt the candle and gone off for a party and come back at 4 in the morning. But what's happening is the yin is dwindling as the day goes on. And even though we may push it and actually go 18, 20, 24 hours without actually sleep, the yin, the wood, is dwindling. And so eventually what will happen is actually the yang will collapse. And we'll go into the sleepy time yin stage. And overnight, we are nourishing the wood. The result of this process, this energy that goes on in the human body, burning the wood, is basically metabolic wastes, ash. And we know in traditional medicine, that's what you say, really. The body, actually, as I said before, does a great effort of cleansing the ash by getting an acute illness. That's the way it clears out the ash. If you don't ever clear out the ash and you keep piling on wood, nourishment, too much, what will happen is basically you'll end up with complete stagnation of the body and will get an acute chronic illness. So this, and if you're not nourishing the yin, the yang is, you're going to have to push it. People have speed, they have amphetamines, they have cocaine, they have these speedy things, and this basically pushes it's like pouring paraffin on a fireplace. That's not going to nourish anything. And people will burn out, and we even have the analogy, the metaphor. We say, oh, you've burnt out. Exactly right. It's basically the yin, the wood of the fire, has been burnt out. So that's the energy. That's number 2 in this concept of the vital force. And the third one, and let me just go back a fraction. Interestingly enough, of the great civilizations of the world, the Greek civilization really did focus very much on intelligence. And it's the concept of pneuma. And so the vital force from the Greek perspective, and this is what's happened to us in the West, we have very much focused on intellect. That's where we are. In China, they basically actually would be much more in terms of energy. And it's interesting because you see the Qigong and various martial arts, and they're looking at the movement of energies. If there was an equation that described the Chinese approach to energy, it's E equals mc squared. It's Einstein's equation, because energy, is basically the speed of light times the mass squared. And really that's what goes on with energy. The Chinese culture understands energy really well. Then as far as actually the third aspect to the vital force, that's actually the glue. That is the stuff that holds everything together. That is the connection. That is the issue of relationships. Not only relationships of you to another person, and you to the trees, and you to your own dog or cat or whatever, you to actually basically everything, including the clouds, the rain, the seasons, but also aspects of you being connected with you. It's your spirit, how your spirit connects with your body, how your psyche connects with your body, how your psyche connects with your spirit, how aspects of your psyche connect. And these are very much coming out of, not coincidentally, the culture of India. And so in many ways, the glue that holds everything together from a spiritual point of view is, some people would say it's love. It's a connection, holds everything together. I find it illuminating in the wisdom, the wisdom of all languages, but English language. We actually have a thing with the word live, L-I-V-E, and curiously enough, if you actually reverse it and you spell it backwards, it's E-V-I-L, evil. And so evil, you know, the bad side of things, is basically anti-life, anti-live. And funnily enough, actually, in, you know, the Judeo-Christian concept of the devil, there's only a D separating actually the devil from evil. In our language, in the linguistic brilliance of all languages, in English, what we have is live is just actually has an I in it, L-I-V-E. But love actually has a circle, it's an O, and it's all encompassing. And so in many ways, the language, or the English language, of coming up with the word love is very much about enclosing everything, being connected to everything. And that's really what the third aspect of the vital force is, being connected to everything. That's really what actually the vital force underpins everything in life, and it underpins health.